1.4 Language in Use. Now that you're aware of Hockett's design features, which are really just a list of the distinctives that we can refer to in trying to define what constitutes human language, I want to look more specifically at how humans are using the languages that they have. So here are some things that you will want to keep in mind as we start considering the languages of the world. As I've already said, humans are wired for language. Wherever human communities exist, language exists. But here's something that you might not have considered. That is the idea that there are no primitive languages. People tend to want to create hierarchies. They want to have high status and low status, and they've done it with languages. We can talk about languages versus dialects. Often that term dialect is simply being used to say this is some sort of lower status form of language. Or you may have heard, well, that's just a primitive language. They can't really say all of the ideas that we can say in English. I've had people ask me, how could you translate the Bible in those languages? They don't have those concepts available to be able to put all of those religious ideas into their language, do they? But the reality is that all of humanity is made in the image of God. That means there isn't a segment, a culture, a group of people, who we can point to and say, oh, those people don't have the same innate mental acuity that we do. They don't have the same potential we do for communication and for living out their humanity in the same way that we do. The idea that we would need to label some languages and cultures as primitive foundationally flows out of racist attitudes. It turns out that our shared humanity means that every culture has those deep thinkers. Every culture has orders. Every culture has those people who aren't that good with words. But every language then develops to be adequately complex for all of those ideas that are common to all of humanity. It turns out that as we've gone into the world and learned new languages and tried to put messages into those new languages, we have proven the idea that any message in one language can be expressed in another language according to the linguistic resources and the patterns that are natural in that new language. It turns out that all languages are equally complex. This is an important part, although they differ in areas of complexity. All human languages that are functioning for society, by definition, must be capable of carrying the same information load. They have to be able to communicate well enough to meet all of the needs of the people. That doesn't mean that every language approaches reaching that complexity with the same strategy. Some languages may bring their complexity with their morphology. Maybe they use lots of endings to get the complexity. Some may have lots of sounds, very complex sound systems, or maybe tonal systems. Others might just use tons of vocabulary, like English does. But every language will have an identifiable strategy that gets them to the complexity they need for human communication. Now, as individuals speaking specific languages, our perceptions can vary on what languages are hard for us to learn and which languages are easier for us to learn. It goes back to those language trees that we were looking at. If we're learning a language that is close in proximity to us or has a historic link to us in one of those trees, we're going to find that language easier to learn. We're going to say, that's an easy language. Then we're going to look at languages that maybe are geographically distant from us, and maybe not even on the same language tree. We are going to say, oh, that's a hard language. So for Americans, we look at Spanish, and we're like, oh, that's easy. We look at Mandarin, and we say, oh, that's impossible. But the fact is, Mandarin, Spanish, and English are all functioning in their contexts in adequate ways for the people to live successful lives, and to communicate well, and even artistically use that language in their contexts.